Okay, so let's unpack this. Because for the last 100 years or so, biology textbooks have basically been telling us a lie.
A pretty significant one, yeah.
Right. They've claimed that you have this vegetative nervous system running your heart, your gut, your lungs, and that you have absolutely no control over it.
Not at all, yeah. That was the dogma.
Exactly. The whole story was that this biological machinery is totally walled off, like it's down in the body's engine room, strictly involuntary,
Yeah.
and just chugging away in the dark without you having to lift a single finger or, even think about it.
And it is a massive assumption, honestly. I mean, it's baked into the very language we use. The word autonomic, it comes from the Greek word autonomos, which literally means self-governing.
Right, like it's its own boss.
Exactly. But what's fascinating here is that century-old wall between voluntary and involuntary, it's actually crumbling. And it's crumbling fast.
Because we're finding out that involuntary is really just kind of a default mode, not an absolute rule. If you look at the sources for today's deep dive, there are decades of biofeedback research showing people can actually learn to consciously raise or lower their own heart rate and blood pressure.
Oh, absolutely.
And I mean, you have practitioners of techniques like the Wim Hof method who can measurably shift the balance of this system just through targeted breathing, which is wild.
It is wild. And modern neuroscience is finally providing the hardware explanation for how that is even possible.
Yeah, tell me about that, because that's the missing link, right?
Yeah, researchers studying interoception, which is basically how the brain senses the body's internal state, they've zeroed in on a specific region in the brain called the insular cortex.
Okay.
It acts like this continuously updated radar map of your internal bodily states. But the thing is, it's a two-way street.
Meaning it's not just receiving data.
Exactly. The insular cortex doesn't just read the data. It can actually modulate this supposedly automatic output based on cognitive and emotional processing.
So it can push back. That's incredible. So by the end of this deep dive, you're going to understand this ancient wiring that literally keeps you alive while your modern lifestyle is confusing the heck out of it, and how you might actually have a say in how it operates.
Which is incredibly empowering, really.
Definitely. But to understand how we can influence this autopilot, we first have to map out the actual physical hardware of how it's wired.
The blueprint, so to speak.
Right. And to do that, I think it helps to contrast it with the system we are all familiar with, which is the somatic nervous system. That's the part you use to intentionally move your muscles.
Yeah, and the somatic system is structurally very, very simple. It's a direct one-motor neuron-to-muscle setup.
Like a direct flight.
Perfect analogy, yes. One single continuous wire runs straight from your spinal cord all the way down your arm to your bicep. You think about moving it, the electrical signal travels down that one wire, and boom, the muscle contracts.
But the autonomic nervous system doesn't work like that at all.
Not at all.
It always has a layover. It operates on a distinct two-neuron relay. So imagine a first neuron, the preganglionic neuron, leaving the central station of your brainstem, or your spinal cord. But it doesn't go all the way to the organ. It stops at a peripheral ganglion, which is basically a biological layover terminal.
Right.
And there, it hands off the message to a second neuron, the postganglionic neuron, which then takes the final leg of the trip to the target organ.
And that layover isn't just some weird anatomical quirk, you know? It serves a really vital purpose, which is amplification and control.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, one neuron arriving from the central station can synapse or connect with dozens of second-leg neurons at that layover terminal.
So it multiplies.
Exactly. A single signal from the brain can suddenly fan out to affect a massive area. And that two-flight system is divided into two main architectural divisions, which were originally mapped out around the turn of the 20th century. First, you have the sympathetic division, which is famously associated with the fight or flight response.
Right. And the geometry of how this is laid out, it makes total sense when you think about what it actually needs to do.
It really does.
The central flights for the sympathetic system exit from the middle of your back.
Yeah.
Like the thoracolumbar outflow, from T1 to L2.
Huh.
They don't come from the brain or the tailbone. They come right out of the central spine.
Which positions them perfectly for a rapid systemic alarm. In the sympathetic system, that first flight is incredibly short. The layover terminals, the ganglia, they sit in a chain right alongside your spinal cord.
Just boom, right outside the door.
Yeah. So the signal exits the spine, immediately hits the layover, and triggers this massive coordinated second flight. Those secondary nerves are very long, traveling all the way out to distant organs to, dilate your pupils, accelerate your heart, and halt your digestion all simultaneously.
So short first flight, Massive layover amplification, long second flight.
Exactly.
And the chemical messengers they use to pass the baton are crucial here.
Mm-hmm.
At the layover terminal, the first neuron drops a chemical called acetylcholine. But when that second long neuron finally reaches the heart or the lungs, it drops a completely different chemical. It drops norepinephrine, which is essentially adrenaline.
Now, contrast that with the parasympathetic division, which is often called rest and digest.
The chill one.
Right, the chill one. The geometry there is the mirror image. The first neurons don't exit from the middle of the back. They exit from the very top, the craniosacral outflow, meaning the brainstem, and the very bottom, the base of the spine.
Meaning they totally bypass that chaotic sympathetic chain in the middle.
They do. These parasympathetic nerves, like the famous vagus nerve, wandering down from the brainstem to the gut, which carries like 75% of these fibers. By the way, they have incredibly long first flights.
They just keep going.
Yeah, they travel almost the entire distance to the target organ. The layover ganglion is located right next to, or sometimes physically embedded inside, the tissue of the organ itself.
Wow.
So from there, a microscopic second flight takes it the final millimeter. This allows for highly targeted, precise control over individual organs without sounding a whole body alarm.
And chemically, it's a lot simpler, right? The parasympathetic system just uses acetylcholine at both stops, the layover and the final destination.
Correct. Both stops.
But wait, this brings up, like, the ultimate trick question in human anatomy from our sources. Sweat glands.
Oh, the sweat glands.
Yes. They completely break the rules we just laid out. They are part of the sympathetic fight-or-flight system, hardwired to respond to stress and heat.
Right.
But instead of using norepinephrine at the final destination like every other sympathetic nerve, they inexplicably use acetylcholine.
It's a brilliant evolutionary anomaly, honestly.
It's like booking a sympathetic flight but arriving with parasympathetic luggage. Why on earth would evolution do that?
It comes down to the mechanics of thermoregulation. When you need to cool down, you need a sustained, localized response in the skin. If sweat glands relied on norepinephrine, which is the same chemical that spikes your heart rate and your blood pressure every time you got a little warm, your entire cardiovascular system would go into overdrive just to produce a drop of sweat.
That sounds exhausting.
It would be. So by swapping the neurotransmitter at the very end to acetylcholine, the body can trigger sweat production using that sympathetic wiring without accidentally causing a full-blown panic attack.
That is so clever. Okay, so knowing these physical wires run from the spine to the organs is one thing.
Yeah.
But how did scientists actually prove that they were using chemicals like acetylcholine and norepinephrine to communicate?
Well, it took a while.
Because before modern imaging, the assumption was just that nerves zapped organs with pure electricity, right?
Yeah, exactly. And honestly, before we could even prove the chemistry, we struggled just to name the system. In the 1800s, it was called the vegetative nervous system.
Right.
A term coined by a French anatomist named Bichat. He split life into animal life, meaning voluntary movement, and vegetative life, which was the involuntary visceral stuff like digestion.
Which kind of implies we are basically just houseplants on the inside.
Right. And a British physiologist named John Newport Langley absolutely hated that label. So in 1898, he pushed the term autonomic into use because he wanted a name that reflected its structural independence.
Because of those layover ganglia.
Yes, he realized those meant the system could function somewhat on its own. Then, a few decades later, Harvard's Walter Bradford Cannon gave us the phrase fight or flight, and he coined the term homeostasis.
Homeostasis, right.
Cannon showed that the autonomic nervous system wasn't just static background noise. It was the body's ultimate tool for maintaining dynamic internal stability in a constantly changing, chaotic external world.
Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting. Cannon and Langley were still just observing the effects. Proving how the message physically jumped the gap between the nerve ending and the organ required a completely different leap of logic.
It did.
And that brings us to Otto Loewy in 1921, who supposedly literally dreamed up the experiment design, woke up in the middle of the night, and scribbled it down on a piece of paper.
It is such a great story, and it remains one of the most elegant experiments in the history of physiology. So, Loewy took 2 beating frog hearts and isolated them in separate glass chambers filled with a warm saline solution.
Okay, 2 frog hearts in salt water.
Right. The first heart still had its vagus nerve, the main parasympathetic nerve attached to it. Loewy electrically stimulated that vagus nerve. Predictably, because it's a parasympathetic nerve, the first heart slowed down.
Right, because parasympathetic is the brake.
Uh-huh.
And if the electrical zap was the only thing communicating with the heart, the story would just end there.
Exactly. But Lowy took the saline fluid that was bathing that first heart, extracted it with a pipette, and transferred that exact fluid into the chamber holding the second, completely untouched heart. He did not stimulate the second heart's vagus nerve at all.
But the second heart slowed down too, which is just wild when you think about it.
It is.
Because electricity cannot hold a charge in a pool of fluid, get scooped up in a pipette, and wait around to stimulate a second heart.
No, it can't. It proved that the electrical signal in the first nerve had triggered the physical release of a chemical substance into the fluid. The fluid carried the chemical over to the second heart, where it bound to receptors on the muscle cells, changing their electrical state and forcing the heart to slow down. Lowy called this mysterious substance Vagustoff, which literally translates to Vegas stuff.
Vegas stuff. I love how blunt that is. And Vagustoff turned out to be acetylcholine, which is the very first neurotransmitter ever identified. He proved once and for all that nerves talk to organs using chemistry.
And he won the Nobel Prize in 1936 for it. This discovery, it's the foundation of almost all modern pharmacology. Every time you take a drug to alter your heart rate, your digestion, or your airways, you are manipulating the chemical transmission system that Lowy discovered in those frog hearts.
That's amazing. So we have these chemical messengers maintaining homeostasis, constantly balancing the heart, the lungs, the gut. But what does that invisible balancing act actually feel like for you, the listener, in real time? And, what happens when the hardware breaks down?
Well, you experience this high-speed chemical balancing act every single time you stand up from a chair.
Really? Just standing up?
Just standing up. Think about the physical mechanics involved. When you stand up, gravity instantly pulls your blood downward, causing it to pool in your legs.
Okay, yeah.
For a fraction of a second, the blood pressure supplying your brain drops. You'd pass out every single time you stood up, except you have these stretch-sensitive receptors called baroreceptors located in your carotid artery and your aortic arch.
So they literally feel the physical stretching of your blood vessels decrease as the pressure drops.
Exactly. They detect that pressure drop within a single heartbeat, and they instantly trigger a rapid autonomic correction. The central nervous system immediately slashes vagal output, pulling the parasympathetic brake off your heart while simultaneously spiking sympathetic output.
Wow, so it's doing both at once.
Yes. This dumps norepinephrine into the system, which constricts the blood vessels in your legs and shoots your heart rate up, forcing the blood back up to your brain. This entire recalculation happens in a matter of seconds.
And when it's sluggish, like if you're dehydrated or on certain medications, you get that horrible head rush feeling where your vision goes dark.
Precisely.
Now, this mechanism brings up a massive pop culture myth. Wait, because pop culture tells us constantly that the sympathetic system is the bad, toxic stress guy,
Right.
and the parasympathetic is the good, healing, chill guy. But the sources show that's a total misconception.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it is an incredibly dangerous oversimplification. Both systems are constantly active, fine-tuning your organs in a dynamic dance. Sympathetic tone is absolutely required just to keep your blood pressure up during normal daily activity. It's not solely reserved for fighting off wild animals.
Right, it keeps you upright.
Yeah, and the parasympathetic system isn't always the hero either.
Right, because too much chill is literally dangerous. Look at vasovagal syncope.
Exactly. Vasovagal syncope is the medical term for fainting triggered by things like the sight of blood, extreme emotional shock, or intense pain. In those moments, the calming parasympathetic system vastly overcorrects.
It goes into overdrive.
It dumps so much acetylcholine into the heart that it drops your heart rate and blood pressure aggressively and rapidly. Your brain loses oxygen and you lose consciousness. Fainting isn't a sympathetic panic overload, it's a parasympathetic overload.
The system can cause real harm on both ends of the spectrum. But what about when the physical wires themselves degrade? The mechanics of diabetic autonomic neuropathy are terrifying when you realize how dependent we are on these nerves.
The mechanism of injury there is entirely structural. Chronic high blood sugar alters cellular metabolism and damages the tiny capillaries that supply oxygen to the nerves. Because autonomic nerves are incredibly thin and often very long, they are exceptionally vulnerable to oxygen starvation.
That makes sense.
So as they degrade, the system loses its ability to communicate. Patients develop conditions like gastroparesis, where the stomach simply won't empty because the vagus nerve can no longer coordinate the complex muscular contractions required to move food.
And you also see resting tachycardia, right? where the heart races at like 100 beats a minute, even when the person is just sitting on the couch, because that vagal brake we talked about is completely broken.
Yes.
The parasympathetic system physically cannot get the chemical message to the heart to slow down.
It is a stark, devastating demonstration of what happens when the physical wiring is destroyed.
Yeah. But what happens if you bypass the central wiring entirely? Could an organ just run itself? Because this leads to some massive unresolved debates among modern scientists in our sources about what even counts as part of the autonomic nervous system.
Right, and the biggest debate centers entirely around the enteric nervous system, or the gut brain.
The gut has this semi-independent network of about 500 million neurons. If you think about the somatic system and the rest of the autonomic system as employees, they take their orders from the main office in the brain. But the enteric nervous system is like an independent contractor. It doesn't even need a phone call from headquarters to get the job done. It can initiate the complex, wave-like muscular contractions for digestion, which is peristalsis entirely on its own, even if the vagus nerve connecting it to the brain is completely severed.
Which is a level of autonomy found in absolutely no other peripheral tissue in the human body. Because of this, classical textbooks stick to just two divisions of the autonomic nervous system: sympathetic and parasympathetic.
That's changing.
It is. Many modern physiology texts now treat the enteric nervous system as a distinct third division. Others classify it as an entirely separate entity. It is a genuine classification crisis based on how weirdly independent the gut is.
Speaking of debates, we really have to talk about the vagus nerve and polyvagal theory, because this is everywhere in pop psychology right now.
Oh, it really is. Polyvagal theory was proposed by a psychophysiologist named Stephen Porges in 1994. The theory argues that the vagus nerve isn't just one simple parasympathetic brake. Porges suggests it is functionally split into two distinct evolutionary branches.
Okay, two branches.
Yes. There's a supposedly older, unmyelinated dorsal vagal path that triggers primitive shutdown or freeze responses when we are trapped, and a newer myelinated ventral vagal path tied to social engagement, feeling safe, and calm connection.
So Porges argues these branches interact with the sympathetic fight-or-flight system in a strict hierarchy of how we respond to threats. And this framework has been massively adopted by trauma therapists and psychotherapists.
Because it provides an incredibly compelling clinical narrative. It helps patients remove the shame from their trauma responses by framing a freeze response as an ancient biological failsafe, not a personal failure.
Which is really helpful for people.
Definitely. However, this raises an important question because basic research physiologists and neuroanatomists push back heavily against it.
Right. What is the friction there between the clinical side and the basic science side?
The basic scientists argue that the anatomical and evolutionary claims in polyvagal theory just don't hold up under a microscope. For instance, the theory claims that the social engagement ventral vagal path is unique to mammals. But evolutionary biologists point out that lungfish and reptiles actually possess similar neuroanatomical structures.
Oh, wow.
Furthermore, physiologists argue that trying to cleanly map complex psychological states like feeling socially connected onto specific, distinct anatomical branches of a single nerve oversimplifies the massive whole brain network required to process human emotion.
So it's this fascinating cultural moment where a useful therapeutic metaphor for stress and regulation has kind of completely outpaced the underlying biological evidence, yet it continues to shape how millions of people understand their bodies.
It highlights how desperate we are for frameworks to understand our own internal states. We are trying to make sense of a biological system that is increasingly mismatched with our modern environment.
Which brings us to why all this ancient wiring matters for you, the listener, right now. Because we are dealing with a profound biological mismatch.
We really are.
Take the fight-or-flight response. It actually operates in two distinct phases. First, you have the immediate neural sympathetic response. We discussed the surge of norepinephrine that raises your heart rate in seconds.
Right.
But that is followed by a slower secondary hormonal response driven by the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis.
The HPA axis dumps cortisol into your bloodstream. While norepinephrine is the fast electrical spark, cortisol is the slow-burning log. It sustains the stress reaction over minutes or hours, keeping your blood sugar high and your immune system suppressed so you have the energy to survive a prolonged physical threat.
So what does this all mean? The problem is, today, this massive physiological mobilization isn't triggered by a tiger chasing us. It gets triggered by an angry email from a boss, a looming mortgage payment, or just, sitting in gridlock traffic.
We're revving a sports car engine in a traffic jam. The sympathetic surge and the cortisol wave mobilize all this energy, flood the blood with glucose, and accelerate the heart.
And then you just sit there at your desk.
Exactly. There is nowhere for that mobilized physical energy to go. The body is preparing for a physical sprint, but the threat is purely psychological.
And we can actually see this toll in real time now. If you look at modern wearables like an Oura Ring, an Apple Watch, a Whoop strap, they are constantly tracking a metric called HRV, or heart rate variability.
HRV is a direct window into the tug-of-war between your sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. A healthy heart doesn't beat like a metronome.
It's not perfectly steady.
No, not at all. When you inhale, the pressure in your chest changes and your brain briefly lifts the parasympathetic vagal brake. Your heart speeds up slightly. When you exhale, the brake is reapplied and the heart slows down. That micro variation between beats is called respiratory sinus arrhythmia.
So high HRV means your parasympathetic and sympathetic systems are dynamically dancing, making rapid beat-by-beat adjustments. It means you are resilient and relaxed.
Yes.
But low HRV means the sympathetic system is flooring the gas pedal, drowning out those subtle vagal adjustments entirely.
Clinically, the stakes of understanding the system are much higher than just managing daily stress. Anesthesiologists, for example, they have to actively fight vagal drops during intubation.
Really?
Oh, yeah. The physical insertion of a breathing tube can stimulate the vagus nerve so intensely that it can actually stop a patient's heart right on the operating table.
That is terrifying. And we're also seeing a massive spike in dysautonomia, which is dysfunction of the autonomic system because of long COVID. Right?
Yeah, specifically a condition called POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. It's a malfunction of the exact baroreceptor reflex we discussed earlier. The autonomic regulation of heart rate and blood vessel constriction is damaged.
So when they stand up,
When a patient with POTS stands up, the blood vessels fail to constrict properly, so the heart starts racing wildly to compensate, causing severe exhaustion, brain fog, and dizziness.
and then there's the absolute clinical emergency of autonomic dysreflexia, which happens in severe spinal cord injuries.
That is a terrifying scenario. It occurs in people with spinal cord injuries at or above the sixth thoracic vertebra. Below the level of the severed injury, the body might experience a painful stimulus, like a bladder that is too full, or even just tight clothing.
Okay.
The sensory nerves fire, but the signal can't get past the severed spinal cord to reach the brain.
So the brain doesn't even know there is pain.
Right.
But the local nerves still react.
Violently, they trigger a massive, unchecked sympathetic surge below the injury. Blood vessels constrict, and blood pressure spikes to lethal levels.
Oh my God.
The brain, via those baroreceptors in the neck, senses this terrifying high blood pressure. It panics and sends a signal down the vagus nerve to slow the heart down and lower the pressure. But the vagus nerve only reaches the heart and upper organs. It physically cannot send a signal past the spinal injury to dilate the constricted blood vessels in the lower body.
So the heart rate plummets, but the blood pressure stays lethally high.
Yes.
If the initial trigger isn't found and fixed quickly, it can cause a stroke or death. It's a tragic case where the body's own internal checks and balances become a fatal liability just because the central coordinator is severed.
It is, but on the flip side, our understanding of these chemical messengers has also saved millions of lives. In the mid-20th century, scientists realized that norepinephrine didn't just bind to one generic receptor. There were different subtypes of receptor keyholes on different organs, specifically alpha and beta adrenergic receptors.
Which led Scottish pharmacologist Sir James Black to invent beta blockers, right? Like propranolol.
He won the Nobel Prize in 1988 for it. A beta blocker drug physically sits in the beta receptor keyholes on the heart muscle, blocking the adrenaline from binding.
So it plugs the lock.
Exactly. Even if your brain is panicking and flooding your system with sympathetic norepinephrine, the chemical can't connect to the heart. The heart stays calm. We use this mechanism to treat hypertension, prevent heart attacks, and even manage severe performance anxiety.
We've covered incredible ground today. We mapped out the two-neuron relay and its layover terminals. We looked at Otto Lowy's isolated frog hearts, proving that nerves use chemical messengers to run the machine.
A lot of ground, yeah.
And we dismantled the myth that the sympathetic system is just bad stress and the parasympathetic is just good calm, showing they're really a continuous life-saving balancing act.
We also explored the edges of what we don't know, from the fierce debates over the gut's independence to the friction between clinical psychology and basic anatomy regarding polyvagal theory.
Which leaves us with the final thought for you to ponder. At the very beginning, we discussed how the definition of involuntary is changing. Through biofeedback, breathwork, and interoception, we know the brain maintains a continuously updated map of our internal states and can actually alter them.
It's not a closed loop anymore.
Right. And now with wearables, we have real-time digital dashboards of our autonomic balance strapped to our wrists. So here is the question to take with you. Are we entering an evolutionary era where humans can consciously pilot their own vegetative functions?
It's a profound thought. As we merge our ancient biology with modern feedback technology, the lines between what happens to us and what we control are really blurring.
If the engine room door is finally unlocked, what happens to human health when the involuntary truly becomes voluntary? Something to think about the next time you feel your heart skip a beat.